So in this video, what we're going to talk about is the 20th century, so everything from 1900, and we're going to talk about the changing nature of crime. So the first crime we're going to look at is being a conscientious objector. So this very much came about in the First World War. So before 1916, joining the army was voluntary, but after 1916, when we were fighting the Germans, we needed more men in the army. So they introduced conscription, and we know that conscription is compulsory joining of the army. But there were some individuals in Britain, men of a certain age, that felt that for moral and religious and political reasons they shouldn't fight. Some of them were pacifists and felt like fighting was just wrong completely. However, the government was very wary of this, and the army was as well, because if you had some individuals who chose not to fight, then obviously more individuals might choose not to fight. So they treated them very harshly. So you weren't allowed to be a conscientious objector. So you were put in prison, you were sentenced to hard labour. If in the army you joined and then you tried to run away, then you would potentially be shot. So it was very harshly dealt with during the First World War. In the Second World War, they became slightly more lenient. You've got to remember, in the Second World War, we're fighting the Nazis. So if we're being really hard on our own people for moral and religious reasons, then that doesn't look particularly good, particularly when you're saying, well, we're fighting these evil Nazis. So they're far more lenient in the Second World War in terms of the treatment towards them. Now, when we're looking at crime in the 20th century, what we've got to remember is obviously that idea of change. What we perceive today, obviously, that's happened through change. And these things might seem a bit odd to us. So homosexuality, for example, prior to 1967, homosexuality was a crime. And it wasn't until 1967 that the Sexual Offences Act legalised homosexuality. And as we know, throughout the 20th century, views towards gay people have changed. We've become a more tolerant society, which is great. And in 2005, it outlawed homophobia. Now, obviously, there are still people who commit these crimes and who are homophobic. But obviously, it is now a law that you can't be. Now, as we've discussed, there is a number of reasons that obviously homosexuality becomes more accepted in society. One of those in the 20th century is there's a decline in religion-based intolerance. So the church used to be very against homosexuality, but obviously those attitudes in the church have started to change. In the 1960s, liberal attitudes to things became more accepted. People became more accepting of things, and politicians like Roy Jenkins, who was the Home Secretary, played a big part in pushing forward these ideas. There's also greater sexual tolerance in the 21st century. So ideas around these things we would accept in the 21st century obviously would seem quite alien to people beforehand, but we do see them as the norm now, to be accepting, which is the right thing. Crimes to do with race are also an interesting topic in the 20th century. So in 1968, the Race Relations Act was made, and it made it illegal to refuse work or housing on racial grounds in Britain. That's backed up by the 2005 Criminal Justice Act, which stated that racial hatred made another crime worse. So obviously, racial hatred, not just excluding people from jobs, but actually actively being racist also had an issue, also became against the law. And that's because Britain as a country starts to change. So in the 1950s, we get this mass immigration from places like the West Indies. After the World War II, we needed to rebuild Britain. So England becomes a far more diverse country. It was quite a homogenous country beforehand. So there was a hope for a tolerant, multicultural society. Now, you could argue, if we took to the present, that actually we've still got significant issues in this country today. We know in the news, obviously, over the past couple of weeks, there's been mass issues in terms of race. So it's still a very, very poignant and topical issue. Abortion is also something that becomes a crime in the 20th century. So it's illegal before 1967, so it's a crime before 1967. However, after 1967, it is made legal, so women get the right to choose. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is there is a decline in religious attitudes. If you would take, for example, the Christian church, and particularly the Catholic church, they're very against abortion because they see it as murder, whereas actually I think most kind of Protestants have started to decide that actually it's the woman's choice. And there was also a rise in feminism. So in the 1960s, women start to fight back from that idea that their place is just the home. And actually they want to have choice over their own body. They don't think it is the government's right to dictate what they do with their own body. And again, the role of the Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, is significant. So he's the one that makes it legal to have an abortion. One of the other issues in the 20th century is domestic violence. So in the earlier part of the 20th century, domestic violence is seen as a domestic issue. So it's something that should be dealt with in the home. And it's not actually until 1976 that the Domestic Violence Act came in that gave women more rights. So it basically was ignored until that point. So if a man was domestically violent towards a woman, the police said, well, it's kind of a domestic issue. It's nothing really to do with us. Incredibly, it wasn't until 1991 that rape was made illegal in marriage. So women obviously start getting more rights, and that domestic violence is now seen as a very serious crime, and the crime that it should be seen as very serious, but it wasn't seen as serious before. And again, this is because of the rise in feminism, women's refusal to be bullied by men. So women's status has increased significantly over the 20th century. In terms of drugs, in the past, most drugs were legal, but relatively little were used. And it's not actually until 1971 that the Misuse of Drugs Act came in. And the reason that came in 1971 is that in the 1960s, that kind of hippie movement, we see a lot more use of harder drugs, so far more dangerous drugs like LSD. And so the government felt like it needed to create a law about the misuse of drugs. There are also different levels of drugs. So we know that obviously there's different class of drugs. There is more debate about using drugs that don't harm others today. So the cannabis, for example, is a drug that's always used in the debates, that some think that it's perfectly reasonable to legalise cannabis because they don't see it as any more dangerous than smoking or drinking, whereas others say that obviously it is a slippery slope to other drugs. And the last thing we're going to look at is modern versions of old crime, and one in particular, terrorism. Now, terrorism is not a new thing. We've looked at the gunpowder plot before in 1605, and that is a terrorist act. That was terrorists trying to kill the king at the time. So terrorism is not new. However, obviously there are new versions of that terrorism. So in the 1970s and 1980s in Britain, the IRA, or the Irish Republican Army, wanted independence from Greater Britain. So obviously there's big contention around Northern Ireland, and to try and get their message across, they used to use bombings, they would use terrorism, they would use violence to try and do that. Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State is probably the thing that you know the best. So from 2001, with the crashing into the Twin Towers, then Al-Qaeda became a major issue. That has now formed into this group Islamic State, or IS, who are now a significant threat across the world. So obviously we know in London there's been IS terrorist attacks over the last couple of years. But obviously what we want to say is obviously terrorism is probably more widely reported these days, but actually terrorism has always existed, and actually Spain have had issues with terrorism, and lots of other countries. So while it is a different version, these things have existed previously.